Okay, guys, so let's get back to our code where we left off. Please, again, I'm asking you if there's any question or anything that you need to say, please speak up here. I don't have a QQ to see your messages. Okay, so this is the logic that we have so far. It's a very simple logic, but basically, all I want to show you is the structure of an MVC application. We have a bunch of errors. Let's see if we can find them out. Yes, sorry. So just I had to save it to get rid of those errors. Okay, so at the moment we have just one single method here, and this is it. So like I said before, this is not a perfect MVC design, but gradually we'll try to improve this. This is our model class. It's a normal Java class. Now let's go to our controller called beer select. Okay, so with beer select, we don't have logic, but we have to get the request inputs, right? So the user is sending us the color of the beer. We have to get that, and then based on that, we need to display certain information. So since we use the doPost method, let me get rid of these two lines here. Um, so first thing, I'm gonna set response content type. We set it obviously to text HTML. Next thing, I'm gonna get the print writer from the response object print writer, call it out, response dot, oops, sorry, dot get writer. So this needs to be imported from java.io. So in our first version, which is not a great design, I'm going to use servlets to display some information to the user. So I'm going to use this out object to put out some HTML text, beer selection advice, a breaking line. Then I'm going to get the input that the user has entered or has supplied. So I'm gonna need a string object for that. We call it C to, it's just a short short name for color. Request dot get parameter. What is the name of that parameter? Remember from our form, we called this color, right? So I'm gonna say get the color. And then I will say out dot range lm. We just display the color. Say br. You have chosen, and then we add the color. Okay, whatever the color is. And then I'm going to send that color to our model class and get the names of the brands depending on that color. Okay. So what I'm gonna need, because it's an array list, I'm gonna need an iterator to loop through. So what I will do is first I will create an object from this class, beer expert be equals to new beer expert. Oops. New beer expert. Obviously, this needs to be imported. So let's see. Yeah, there it comes. List. What I will do is I will use that object to call the method, which is get brands, and then supply the color. C, okay, which is a string. I will have to implement not this one, not this one, but this one from the util class. Next thing I'm gonna need is to have an iterator. I call it it result dot iterator. Okay, I'm gonna have to import this as well. Not this one, it's from java.util. Okay, so I just need a simple while loop while et has next. Okay, so because some colors, they have multiple brands, therefore I'm gonna need to use a while loop, right? So out.println with display, let's say we have a break line, and then say try these brands dot next. Okay. Add another breaking line. All right, so this is it. So our simple MVC is kind of ready. As I said, there needs to be certain changes to this version, but for now, let's just try and see if we can use our model for the logic, our controller for the inputs, and our form to interact with the client. Okay, I'm gonna go here and run this application. Next, I don't need the previous projects to be loaded on my server. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we have this beer selection page. We choose a color, let's say amber. We submit, and it works. Okay, so the color is amber. The app is making recommendations for this brand and this brand. Actually, there is an extra try here that we don't really need. So we'll have to put that before the loop, right? Okay, so let me go just fix that little thing. So I'm gonna put this before, just to try actually. And okay. Now, this is the version 1 of our application. It works fine, but there are some problems with it. Okay, so let me just rerun it. In terms of functionality, it works, right? We can get the recommendations for whatever color we choose. Let's choose brown. It works, right? The logic is fine. The application works. But this is not what we wanted to do. If you remember what we said about MVC design, we ultimately want to have something like this. Okay, we want to have a view. We have a view, we have a model, we have a controller. But at the moment, can anybody tell me the problem with our application? there's something wrong, something which is not absolutely according to the definition of MVC, and we need to change that. Can anybody tell me what that problem is? Okay, the problem is currently our controller is basically displaying the results, but this isn't right. We want the controller to get input, right? But then we want the controller to get the results from the model, but then send it to view, and then the view will display it. At the moment, our controller is actually getting the input and displaying the output, which isn't right. Okay, so let's go back to our code and fix that quickly. So in order to fix that, first thing, we need to have a JSP or a JSP to display the results. Okay, so I'm going to go here, add a JSP, call it result or whatever. Yeah, new JSP file, we call it result.jsp or whatever you like. I'll finish that. That's fine. And then I'm going to go back to the controller. And rather than displaying the result here, I'm going to copy this information, this bit, and put it in our JSP. So let me just create a simple scriptlet, put this here. I will fix the problems. I know certain things have to change, but I'll go back to controller now. And what I want to do is obviously we have to use a way to forward the request and response to this result page. So we have got the result. Now we, instead of displaying it directly, we have to send it to our JSP file. So I'm going to add this result to the request object as an attribute. So I'm going to say request.set attribute. We call it brands, okay? Or we actually call it styles. We already have brands, we might confuse it. And yeah, the object is called result. Next thing, I'm gonna create a request dispatcher object. We call it view request dot get. Oops, sorry, get request dispatcher. What is the path? Result.jsp. Okay. And the last thing, we just have to forward it, sending both request and response objects. All right, this is it. So this is our controller. Um, this is what the controller should actually look like. So now I'm going to go to result page and fix a few things there. So for our results, right, we're actually, I'm just going to import, all we have to do is to import certain things. First, I'm gonna create, okay. First thing, we need import java.util.list, right? And then we have java.util.iterator. Okay, so I think now this is going to fix this problem. Okay, about the result, what we need to do is to create an object from business beer expert, be equals to new beer expert. Okay, obviously we have to import this one as well. So this is going to be beer.model. That's it. Some problem. Beer.model. Dot. Well, that's a package, of course. I'm gonna say star, or you can say beer.model.beer expert to be more specific. Now what I'm gonna do next thing is I'm gonna use gonna create a list styles, or we call it brands, equals to request. We get that styles from the request. We set it as an attribute earlier, if you remember, and we called it styles, I think. Let me check. Yep, we called it styles. So let's get that. There's a problem. Type mismatch. Okay, this needs to be converted to list. Okay, this one is fine. And the next thing, now we have an object here. So I'm going to create okay, this one we called brands, right? Earlier the name was different. Brands. Let me save it. Okay, now it's working. Iterator. Yep, I think everything is okay. So now the difference is the controller is in between getting the request from the form and passing it to the view, which is this result.jsp. All right, so now let's have another try and see if our application is working now with those changes. Oh yeah, definitely restart server. Okay, I'm gonna go brown, right? Actually, let me restart the server. I want to make sure that the results are being called from here. So I'm going to make a little change. Try these brands. Just to make sure that our results are being retrieved from this results page. Beer select. Okay. There's no. Oh, there is a problem. Actually, we shouldn't display these anymore. Okay, we're not using controller to display anything anymore. Okay, I just need this one. But we don't want controller to display anything. Okay, so let me go back to form and see whether we're able to pull this off. Amber. Yeah, so try these brands. You can see it's working. I'm gonna try light. Yeah, we have Nanchang Pijo. Okay, so this was basically the second version of our MVC. One thing you can do to improve it for the third version, and that will be your own task you can do at home, is to create this model to turn the model, which is Be Your Expert, into a real Java bean. So if you remember Java bean, we have to have getters and setters and private members. And then in result.jsp, one thing you can do to improve this is to use expression language instead of scriptlets. Okay, that will be the third version of your application. So let me close this one for now and go back to our slides where we left off. Okay, so the final thing we saw was that just simply separating out everything into 3 layers doesn't make a good MVC, because ultimately this guy ended up duplicating lots of codes, which is unnecessary. Okay, so if you remember the diagram for model 1, here is the diagram for MVC, which is model 2. We have requests and responses, a controller in between. It could be a filter, it could be a servlet, and then we have models, which is your Java bean, and finally we have views to display the result, the output to the user. Why do we use MVC design pattern? Okay, so at the beginning, it may look like a big task to create different packages, separate out everything into 3 layers, but in the long run, we will reduce development time by breaking down a complex project, a complex system into smaller, manageable tasks. This may actually increase the development time. However, maintenance being um, a very important stage in software development lifecycle, this is going to reduce the maintenance time. Okay. As I said earlier today, that it's going to enhance collaboration because our developers are not going to share the same expertise. Some are good designers, some are good programmers, some are good at database management. So we can have, for example, 3 different teams, one team for every single concern. So the model component represents application data and logic. The view is going to represent the presentation, and it interacts with user. And the controller component basically sits in between and it links model and view. This is the diagram we saw earlier. Controller takes user input from request, figures out what it means to the model, view interacts with the user, sends the form inputs to controller, and lastly, model, which holds the real business logic and the data. So usually in big web applications, there is another layer that is connected directly to the database. It's not usually not the model that connects to the database. Here is the MVC flow of control. We have a form, either an HTML or a JSP. The form is directly connected to servlet, servlet being the controller. Okay. And then we have our business logic, which is in a Java bean, in a simple Java class. The servlet interacts with the model. Okay. it figures out what the output is, what the result is. It sends it, forwards it to the JSP. JSP displays the final result to the user. So our model components is usually Java Beans. If you don't remember Java Beans, just here is just a reminder. We have used Java Beans before. Java Beans must have 0 argument, empty constructor. They shouldn't have any public instance variables. All instance variables of Java Beans have to be made private, if you remember. And then for every private data member, we will have getters and setters. If you want a quick brush up on your Java Beans skills, you can go back to the relevant slides, or you can just read this slide. It's just a very brief reminder of what Java Beans should have. And here's actually an example. We have a private data member, and then we have these getters and setters that provide access to this private member called message. Here are the steps that we just did in our projects to create an MVC with a request dispatcher. So we have to define beans for the result data. Step 2 is using a servlet, which is our controller to handle requests. Obtaining beans instances. This is something we will have to do. So the servlet basically calls the business logic. And we access beans instances in our presentation, okay? Store the bean in the request, session, or servlet context. So we store the bean somewhere that the presentation layer can use. Forward the request to JSP, and finally the JSP will use the beans to extract data from them and to finally display it to the user. It's advisable to use expression language because it makes things a lot simpler on the presentation side rather than using scriptlets that require more coding. Okay. So here is a little example. So, I mean, earlier with JSP 1.2, which is an older version, we didn't have expression language. So we had to do use, for example, JSP use bean or scriptlets to get property of the bean object, but with a JSP2 forward, with JSP2 and the later versions, we actually have expression language, which makes things a lot easier. So doing the same thing in 2 words, we have to run 2 lines of code to get some property from an object. Okay, finally, I have put a live demo of a bigger size web application that uses MVC, but in a larger context. Okay, so let's take a look. There are 8 steps for creating this MVC. I suggest that you try to do this by yourself. Actually, for this one, you will need to create a database, which is what we usually have in real world MVC applications. You will design your project, create a controller, create a connection object, model, view. And in this example, we have an extra step, which is creating a data access DAO layer. Okay, like I said before, in big applications, usually it's the DAO layer that interacts directly with the database rather than the model class. So we have the model that interacts with DAO, and the DAO is directly connected to our database. Finally, we run and test it. So let's see how things unfold here. First thing to do is to create a database. A simple one called a user DB. The table is called user. The database is called user DB. So this is like a login, simple login application using MVC design. We have name, username, and password. We prepare the database, create the tables. Now we think about the project design. This is going to be our project design. So have a look and see what you understand. How many layers do we have? Obviously, we have 4 layers. Usually we don't have this last layer in smaller applications, smaller size application, but here we have DAO connected to database. We have model, which is Java Bean, controller, which is servlet, and then we have a bunch of HTML or JSPs. They're views. So we place these files in a folder called views and under web content. We have 2 different packages for controller and the model. And we have the third package, actually. This one is not a package. This one is just going to be a folder. And these 3 are packages. This one is DAO package. Okay, so let's go through this step by step. First, we create a controller package. Com mypack.controller. Then we create a model package, DAO package, and just a folder to store the views. This is what it's going to look like. 3 packages and 1 folder at the end. Okay, so we begin by creating a controller, but we won't complete the controller. We will complete the controller in the end. So we create a simple controller and like an empty controller at the beginning. And obviously our controller is going to be a servlet. We call it controller servlets. We need the do get, do post init. We change the mapping URL, so we're not going to need a web.xml file because we're using web annotation. Okay, so just testing, we want to test the connection object. Okay. So based on the MVC design, where do you think the connection object has to be made? That's my question. In which layer? In the MVC model? Where do we create the connection object? Where should we create the connection object? Okay, so obviously when you're in servlet class, we don't want to have a connection object there. But just to test our connection object, we're going to create it here, but later we will copy the connection here in the DAO class. Okay, so we want our DAO class to be the only class that has access to database. It gets data from the database, it passes it to the model, and then model decides what to do with it. Okay, so in order to create a connection, we need 4 parameters. We need to have a driver, a URL to the database, and username and password of your database. Okay, so we can actually place these information in our web.xml file as a servlet context parameter. So we have driver, URL, username, and password. Now let's try the connection object. Like I said before, we create the connection object in the controller only to test it. But in the end, we shouldn't have the connection object here. Okay, we don't want to connect to database from our controller. Just basically testing it, make sure it works. Okay, we can create it in init. So if you remember the life cycle of the servlet, this init method is going to be called only once. Okay, so it's kind of an ideal place for connection to be made. So we have these 4 parameters. And we get the connection here. But we don't want to do any SQL from the controller. Okay, just remember that. So we get rid of some pre-generated codes by Eclipse, myEclipse. I mean, if you're using myEclipse does generate these pre-made codes. You can get rid of them. Place yours. So just keep deleting things. All right, so if you remember, we need to have a driver. This is our driver. So we're using MySQL. This is the MySQL connector driver. It needs to be included in your project. If you have already added it to your Tomcat, then it's fine. You don't need to do this step. But if you don't have it in your Tomcat installation folder, you will need to copy it inside your library in your current project. Basically just trying to test the connection, make sure it works. And then we're going to go to our model class. Okay, well, this is an interesting slide here because I want to tell you that the model class is a representation of your database. It's like a mapping from your database to your user model. You have 3 fields here, name, which is nullable, a username, and a password. And likewise, you have the same things here. This is basically a Java bean. And every data member is made private and given access to using setters and getters. And then we go to our model class, set this class as user model. Remember, you can generate getters and setters automatically using your Eclipse, so you don't need to make that extra effort. So this is what the user model.java is going to look like. Next thing is to create the view. Okay. So here we have an index, register, and welcome. The logic of the program, the application is such that you will have a login form. If the user has already made a username, has already created an account, we'll just send him to the welcome page. If he doesn't have an account, we'll send him to the register page. That's basically the logic. Here is our login form. We place it in index.jsp. Then we create register.jsp. This is for first-time users if they don't have an account. Okay, so since we completed these views, let's go back and discuss something important with you in the controller. So if you remember earlier when we were talking about Bob and his web application, if you remember, his friend Kim told him it's unnecessary to have 10 or 12 controllers, servlets, and for every servlet have 10 models. What you can do to improve on that design is to have one controller that basically looks at the URL and it sends the user to the right resource, to the right JSP. So as we go through this example, you will see that what I'm doing here is basically I'm checking the action. We have a parameter action. We check if it's login or if it's register. So earlier we created, if you remember here, right? So here we have action set to controller, and then we have action set to register. So here we can check the action. If it's login, we will send the user, we'll set the parameters into the model, the login. If it's for register, we will actually send the user to registration page, okay? So rather than having 10 controllers, we will have one single controller. It checks what the URL is, what it's looking for, and then based on the action, we send the user to different JSPs, to different views. Here is our DAO class. So with the DAO, we will have SQL commands. If it's an insert or if it's a select, for example. So all the SQL commands are going to be here. Okay. So for example, to log in user, we will have a select statement. If we find a row in our table with this username and password, we return 1, otherwise we'd return 0. And this is basically is going to go back to the model, and then the model is going to send that to the controller. So if action is login, we will call the model here and we get the results. So let's see the complete version. Okay, here's the complete version. So first we have access to the model class. We set the username and password. And then we use the user DAO, which has access to database. We call login user. Remember, login user checks the table. If there is a row with that username, it returns 1, otherwise it returns 0. Okay. So if it's greater than 1, it means this username is valid, so we send the user to the welcome page. Otherwise, we are going to display an error message. If the action is register, then we will just send the user to the register.jsp file. Okay. So for login, we had to do a select statement. When we have register, obviously we're going to insert some data into our database tables. So here we'll have insert user in the user DAO. Remember, in the model, in the controller, we don't have any SQL statements. We have SQL statement in the DAO layer. So we have the connection. We use that to create a statement. We write our insert SQL command, get the values from obviously the values are coming from the view. The view sends it to the controller and controller sends it here. So remember, view is not directly connected to user DAO. If you're creating an MVC application, remember the order and how the layers are linked together. Okay, so this actually brings us to the end of our MVC application, our MVC class. I strongly recommend that you try to create this application at home and see if things go wrong. In one of your labs, you're going to have a task to do MVC, so you need to learn this very well. Last thing, please do not forget your assignment. Your assignment is due on, when is it? On the end of week 12. When is your assignment due? Let me just double check. Assignment part 2 is due on 23rd of May, so please do not forget that. You need to hand it over to your monitor, a report file. Please be prepared for labs. Next week, you will have a lab 1. Okay, so just go through the slides, make sure you watch all the videos, and let me know any questions. If you have any questions, please ask any questions. I'm always available on QQ. I'm just a message away. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for coming, and all the best with your labs and your assignments. I will be in touch with you. All right. So have a good night in Nanchang, and we will be in touch. Thank you. Bye bye.